Good evening and welcome to the Korea Society's new program series, Women's Leadership in the U.S.-Korea Relationship. I'm Tom Byrne, President and CEO of the Korea Society. With the beginning of the new year, the Society is pleased to launch a new program series titled Women's Leadership in the U.S.-Korean Relationship, which will highlight the achievements of Korean and Korean American female leaders in the U.S. and abroad. The series will focus on the importance of women's leadership in Korea, as well as in the U.S.-Korea relationship. Today, in our inaugural episode, we welcome Ambassador Kathleen Stephens, our board chair, for a conversation on her distinguished career and her influential leadership in international relations. Ambassador Stephens was a former U.S. ambassador to Korea from 2008 to 2011, and served as a U.S. Peace Corps volunteer in Korea, political officer in the U.S. Embassy in Seoul, and also led the U.S. consulate in Busan. She also served in a number of positions in Washington, at the Department of State and the White House, and now she holds positions as president and CEO of the Korean Economic Institute and the chair of the Korea Society. Based on her extensive experience and accomplishments, Ambassador Stephens will share her stories on challenges, progress, and advice to support and amplify women's voices. Tonight's moderator is Vivian Lee, Emmy-winning journalist, TV journalist. Vivian anchored and reported at New York 1 for the past 13 years. Some of the notable events that Vivian has covered include the recent 2020 U.S. presidential election, Pope Francis's historic visit to the U.S. in 2015, and Hurricane Sandy in 2012. Before that, Vivian was City TV, Toronto's parliamentary correspondent in Canada's capital, Ottawa, and a reporter at City Pulse News. And I would like to thank Vivian for serving as the master of ceremony at the Korea Society's 2019 annual gala. It was live back then at the Plaza Hotel. Now it is time to turn the screen over to Ambassador Stephens and Vivian. I hope you will all enjoy the conversation between two highly accomplished leaders in their respective fields. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. And Tom Byrne mentioned something that Ambassador Kathleen Stephens and I had been talking about just before we started recording this session, which was that was the last time we had met. And it seemed like such a long time ago, but Ambassador Stephens, welcome to this fireside chat that we've organized with the Korea Society, and thank you so much for being our inaugural guest.
Well, Vivian, thank you. It is lovely to see you again, even remotely, or maybe especially remotely, and really to reflect on all your leadership in journalism and in New York over the years, and thank you so much for your work with the Korea Society.
Thank you. But you say it means a lot coming from someone of your stature. Speaking of which, I think we have in our audience people who are intensely interested in your career path, how you started, where you began. So I'm going to ask you to backtrack a little bit and maybe talk first about how you decided to join the Peace Corps and how you chose Korea to do your service in.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, I grew up at such a different time in the United States. I grew up in the southwestern U.S. in New Mexico and Arizona, and I got interested in Asia in college. It's just that simple. And why did I get interested in Asia? In part because I had a great professor. So maybe there are some things that people even now can relate to. And a very early formative experience for me at the age of 18, when I was an undergraduate, I went to Hong Kong for a year as a year abroad. And, you know, I think for me, as someone coming out of Arizona, going to Hong Kong was probably kind of like someone going to New York, right? It just kind of opened up the world to me. And in this case, it was Asia and the Pacific. And of course, you know, I grew up on the western part of the US, so I kind of looked more at the Pacific. And so it's the one thing led to another sort of story of a life, I think. But it was that initial experience of studying in Hong Kong that made me think I want more. I want to learn more. And especially I wanted to learn more, frankly, about China, with which we did not have a relationship at that time. You know, the young men I knew had been in Vietnam or come back. So I had an interest in politics and in the US and the world that was also sparked by thinking I need to understand more about this big part of the world. And that's what got me interested. So Korea was a chance to go back to Asia, frankly, after I graduated from college and after I came back from that year in Hong Kong. And it was a chance to be in a part of Asia I was very interested in, because again, I couldn't go to China, frankly. If I could have gone to China at that point, I probably would have, on graduate school or teaching or something. But Korea was suggested to me, and I did have a big interest in history. And I knew, that Korea was deeply influenced by China. And I was very interested in things like the way that the countries of Asia had responded to all the challenges that occurred in the 19th and the early 20th century. So Korea just seemed like it'd be a really sort of interesting point to sort of see that on the ground.
So this would have been the 70s.
This was 1975 when I went to Korea, that's right.
So
Which
what
is
did
the same year that the US withdrew from Vietnam.
Okay, so at that time, what struck you when you first landed in Korea, started doing your work there? What did you notice about 1970s Korea? Because that actually turns out to be the decade that my parents emigrated from Korea to Canada. And the stories that they raised me on were quite striking. So I'd really love to hear what your viewpoint was.
Yeah, and that was a decade of enormous immigration from Korea to Canada and the United States in particular. I was really surprised. Again, I arrived, I was 21 years old, but I had this experience of living in Hong Kong, traveling in Southeast Asia. So I thought I knew it. I'd been in Taiwan. I thought I knew a thing or two about Asia. And yeah, arriving in Seoul was a bit of a shock to me. And I could describe, just some of the physical sensations, that it was, it wasn't a very comfortable place to be in many ways. There was not indoor plumbing. There was not a place to take a bath unless you went to a public bathhouse. Rice was rationed. There was much more of a sense of scarcity than I had expected. This was not the luxurious sort of tropics, or even the not so luxurious tropics of Southeast Asia. This was something rather stark. And as I prepared for my Peace Corps assignment and went down to the countryside, I did want to be in the countryside, but Peace Corps volunteers tended to be sent to the countryside for a variety of reasons we could talk about, because there was but one was because of the political situation with a lot of protests within the university. So I went to the countryside, and it was culturally, I think, a more insular and isolated experience than I would have expected, because even though we think of Korea, then and now as a place where there was a huge US influence, I was the first foreigner most Koreans had ever seen. And they were very curious. This is true for all of us who are Peace Corps volunteers, and they were very open in their curiosity. And there wasn't, and we lived Korean style, if you like, and worked Korean style. So as a work experience, and I think this is still true actually of Peace Corps experiences now, you're not working for an American institution, an American embassy, an American bank, an American business. I was working in a Korean school, and I was a young woman who didn't speak Korean hardly at all and didn't seem to have a lot to offer. And so I was very much, subject. Certainly I was a foreigner that never escaped people's notice, but I was within this Korean culture and system, which was every day very challenging to me, but also very intriguing. It was just peeling back layers and layers of complexities that I'm still peeling back. So I think it was the start of this kind of lifelong interest, is too light a word, but this lifelong kind of obsession almost with trying to understand this place and just going deeper and deeper into it. So it really started as more of a regional interest, but once I got there, it was something quite different than I expected, but in many ways, much, much more.
So then how did your career path migrate from your Peace Corps experience to becoming the only female US ambassador to South?
Well, it took a long time, but and it certainly wasn't in my mind particularly.
Exactly.
But it took a long time. But I will say, I think I was really kind of, in the Peace Corps, the thought was, at least back in the 70s, I think, is that we Americans are going to places where people are less well off, where they have something, where we can have something to offer. And oftentimes we thought as well, to show that, kind of a work ethic and here's how you get ahead and so on. And of course, I got to Korea and I mean, I couldn't keep up with the sort of drive that people had, whether it's a drive for education or the drive to get their kids into a better place. I mean, that hasn't changed about Korea at all. It's just this tremendous will. And also this emphasis on education. So it was actually while I was in the Peace Corps in Korea that I took the Foreign Service exam. It turns out Korea is a great place to take an exam, right? And we all know that. It's another thing that hasn't changed, or a terrible place to take an exam, I guess, depending on how you look at it. But I, in those long days and long nights that I was working in a South Korean middle school and living in this little boarding house, I realized, one, I am really interested in what is the U.S. role, not just here but in the world. What I was already interested, but I got to thinking about it more. I certainly had time to read. There was no internet. And I decided, well, I'll take this exam. This is given once a year at the U.S. Embassy, which is the first step towards becoming a career diplomat in the American Foreign Service. It's very Confucian, really. It's like our Confucian high civil servant exam. And I found, once I announced to my principal at my school, where we all sat in this big gyeongmushil, this big room all together, hour after hour, and then going to teach in these unheated classrooms and coming back, that if I said I'm studying for an exam, it gave me a little more status. Here I am, this 21-year-old sort of illiterate, Korean semi-speaker, and I said, well, I'm going to study for the Foreign Service exam, and they said, well, okay. So I got some encouragement for that, and I did take the exam, and I passed it, and that's how I came to join the U.S. Foreign Service. And I think, like many young people, starting off in something, you don't necessarily think you're going to be there forever, and many don't stay in. But I did go back to the U.S. I became a Foreign Service officer in 1978. I served in China after we normalized relations with China, which was a big goal of mine. That's another story we can talk about sometime, U.S.-China relations. But then I went back to Korea in 1983 because guess what? There were very few, almost no one in the Foreign Service at that time who had even a minimal amount of Korean language on their personnel record. And so I raised my hand and said, I do speak some Korean, and here are my test results again. And I'd like to study more, and I'd like to go back to Korea. So I ended up going back to Korea in 1983, this time as a political officer at the embassy. And suddenly it was back in Korea, but I was doing the complete opposite, if you like, of what I was doing as a Peace Corps volunteer. I was following domestic politics. We were told in the 70s as Peace Corps volunteers, stay far away from that, right? Now I was back after the assassination of Park Chung-hee, the violent takeover by Chun Doo-hwan, the getting ready for the Olympics, and I was tossed right into the middle of this seething political scene with a lot of seething anger against the United States. So that was I'm sorry, I'm talking too long about it now, but that was a diplomatic assignment of a lifetime. I mean, people tend to focus on the title ambassador, but that was an extraordinary time when I learned so much about American diplomacy, its strengths and its shortcomings, about the Korean political ambition, as well as the economic ambition to really achieve a democracy. And where I took a lot of lessons, because finally I had to leave. I left in 1989 and ended up going off to Europe for about 15 years to work on post-Cold War Europe. But I took these lessons from Korea, and I always thought I would love to get back to Korea someday. And now I'm telling you a very long story, but as they say in Korean, 어떻게 보니까, somehow I wound my way back into working on Asia again, very late in my career, having passed up a few ambassadorships that were not that interesting to me. And I kind of said, if I'm going to be ambassador anywhere, I think it'd be interesting to be more than interesting. I think I should be ambassador to Korea because I actually know something about the place and I actually speak a little Korean. And by that time, things had changed enough, I think, in the American diplomatic service that there was some openness to the idea. And I had the great good fortune of being nominated and going back as ambassador.
You're describing this entire experience begs the question in my mind, as a woman, as an American woman, how were you treated? But just purely from the perspective of Korean culture is often characterized as placing women second. I think this is being constantly challenged today, more so than in decades past, but you were there in the 70s and then in the 80s, Did you notice how you were treated as a woman by Koreans? And did your nationality as an American help to sway that, change that, blunt it in any way?
Yes, to both questions. Yes, the Korea that I knew in the 1970s and in somewhat different ways, but still profound ways in the 1980s. And of course, I would say American society at that time too, in a different way. There were, far more, shall we say, overt and prescribed, roles and roles for women and ideas about what those roles should be. As a foreigner in Korea, yes, I was somewhat exempt from some of that, but certainly influenced by it. I mean, in the 70s in Korea, I lived in a famously very conservative part of Korea, in an area called Chungcheongnam-do. People proudly said we are very conservative, and by conservative they meant in many ways still adhering to an idea of a neo-Confucian order of life, and in that order, women were at a serious, legal and social and cultural disadvantage in many ways, and very, very prescribed roles. And yeah, so I mean, I had taught in a boys' middle school. There were 5 of us who were women teachers. We all huddled around at the back of the Gilmoshil, and when we went for little picnics together, we all huddled together. We didn't go out drinking with the men. That's why I had all that time to study for the exam. I did have more insight into a woman's experience in Korea, or a different insight, I should say, than my male colleagues, but certainly it's a very different experience. Another Peace Corps volunteer veteran, Laurel Kendall, who was in New York and became a leading scholar on Korean mudang and shamanism, wrote an article for a book recently called "Could Women Have a Peace Corps Experience in Korea?" It was very different, very, very different. But as I said, I think we also experienced a different part of the society in a different way than our male colleagues did. And I think I brought a little bit of that back when I came back in the 80s, and also when I came back as ambassador. And of course, one thing that I don't want to theorize too much about, Korean women and their journey. It's a complicated story, but you had this very formal neo-Confucian and legal system that was really constraining to women in many ways. But I think, at least for a foreign woman like myself, even though I had, as an American woman, far more, if you like, social freedom. I mean, things like, in the 70s, the young women I knew who were my co-teachers, they still expected to have arranged marriages, right? I mean, dating was a very, very modern thing and just starting to come in. But notwithstanding all that, what I did discover, which I'm sure anyone who knows Korea knows well, is Korean women are not, shy and retiring creatures, and do. I'm not trying to overgeneralize, but I mean, I think that we as Americans, American women and men, sometimes took a very superficial, approach to, what the sort of power dynamics were, if you like, and how this played out. And we took it from it's sort of an era of superiority that, well, of course, we're much further along in this. Well, I'm not so sure. We were certainly in some ways in terms of, I said, legal protections and so on, but in others, political participation, control of household finances. I mean, I would say, you would see issues in both societies and in the times that I'm talking about, and indeed now. So it's kind of a complicated thing. I'm sorry, I've given you kind of a roundabout answer, but I in the 80s, I want to mention also that one thing, as I watched, and part of my job was following the human rights issues, the democratization issues. There was a lawyer named Lee Tae-young. She was actually the first woman to be a lawyer in modern Korea. And she ran something called the Family Law Center in Yeouido, before there was other things in Yeouido. And I used to go and see her, and her whole campaign was to change the family law so that women could have rights, especially if they lost their husbands, and a variety of other measures. And she worked on that for years and years and years. And it didn't actually, some of the final changes in the family law, very influenced by Confucianism, weren't changed until a decade ago. So years and years after democratization, and only coming really with democratization. So Korea was also a very kind of, and we still see it going on, as in our own country. So to me, kind of the changes in women's roles, very incomplete story in Korea, incomplete in the United States, but also a very kind of inspiring and powerful one.
You mentioned that your role as an ambassador was very different from your role as a Peace Corps volunteer. For those of us who are not quite sure, because it seems to be kind of it's a position of great respect, but maybe you could break it down into the concrete tasks that you are responsible for completing, initiating. Exactly what does an ambassador do?
Yeah, it's interesting how often one gets that question. This may not be a very satisfactory way to start off, but it does depend on the country, right? It depends on what the relationship is. It's a different thing to be the American ambassador to the Republic of Korea than to be the American ambassador to Iraq or the United Kingdom or Belgrade, or, go on and on, because every relationship. So an ambassador is the senior person on the ground in that country, and even in this globalized world, that makes a difference, who comes as the president, the American president's representative. So there is a very public role to it that says, this is the senior person living here with you in this country to represent the United States. So there's that kind of outward looking, talking about what the United States represents, not only in terms of its, long-term values and aspirations, but in terms of specific policy issues, whether they have to do with, North Korea or with oil from Iran or whatever the subject of the moment is. There's all that. And it's being that person who does that. But there's also that, I think, equally important role, maybe even more important, of, again, with your embassy, with people around you, being the person who can kind of try to relate back to Washington. Here's what's happening here. Here's what's going on. And, again, even in this remote globalized world we live in, I don't think there's any substitute. And I imagine journalists probably feel the same way, for kind of being there, living there. And certainly as an ambassador, you lead a fairly elite existence. It's not a Peace Corps level existence, but you're there and you're talking to people, or at least that's your job. So I think ambassadors generally have quite a bit of latitude in deciding where to spend their own time and where their staffs need to pay attention, need to spend their time. But it's a wide range of things. And certainly in Korea, it's been the trade issues over time, the increasing investment in trade. The free trade agreement was a huge issue when I was there. The North Korea issues. We had the sinking of the Cheonan and the shelling of Yeonpyeong Island while I was there. So that important security dynamic. And of course, there's the military side. But that's tied into political decisions about how the two governments choose to respond. So the ambassador is there to try to knit that up, to provide some advice going both ways. And I think to try to make sure that people in Washington understand that, just understanding that what they're thinking and saying in Seoul, whether from a public opinion point of view or a Blue House point of view, understanding that is important, even if you don't agree with it. You have the, and maybe journalists sometimes have this issue too. You need to report back and still maintain your kind of credibility that, you're not saying this is right necessarily, but you're saying we better understand where this is coming from and how to respond to it and how to deal with it. So that's another important part of it. So you shape it. You have to shape it according to the events, according to the relationship, according, I think, to the priority of a president in power. Now we have a new president now in the United States, and new ambassadors going out will get something that's called a presidential letter, and it will lay out in very broad terms what the priorities are. And we already know what some of them are. I mean, for example, climate change will be one. Cooperation on global health. And so there will be letters that go to ambassadors saying, I want you to work with these countries on this. But how that looks to work with Korea as opposed to China are obviously very different things. And part of what an ambassador and embassy are there to do is to kind of figure out what is possible there and what is going to work and what's not going to work.
I'm glad you mentioned the issue of climate change, because it's become more and more of an urgent matter for governments around the world, definitely for the new administration, more than the previous administration, at least in a stated sense. Can you talk a bit about how that may change the relationship between the US and Korea?
Yeah, South Korea and the United States actually do have a history of working together on climate change. Some of it actually goes back 4 or 5 decades. You know, we even knew about greenhouse gases 4 or 5 decades ago, and NOAA for a long time. In fact, I went out to see it in the mountains of Chungcheongbuk-do, a project where it was collecting data, atmospheric data from the mountains of Chungcheongbuk-do coming in from China to go back in. So there is this kind of long, that's just an example of kind of a long history and bedrock of cooperation on technical and scientific matters. South Korea has made climate change a priority, at least rhetorically. I mean, I think there'd be some criticism within the South Korean body politic, because sometimes it's been more words than deeds, because of course South Korea does remain a country that depends very heavily on heavy manufacturing and is a big carbon emitter. As also suffers from the effects of being close to China and all that pollution that comes over. But there's a consciousness and a political will there to address the problem. And there's also, as a very large economy, but not a large country, particularly in the region, South Korea is always looking at ways to cooperate on a multilateral way. So I think they are going to very much welcome the United States coming back, of course, into the Paris Accords, but also into a commitment, which needs now to be figured out how we're going to do it, but a commitment to work together with other countries on sustainable energy. I think we're going to see a lot of partnerships. We're already seeing some between the big South Korean companies and some of the American companies we already see them in areas like lithium batteries, hydrogen, other energy. A lot of these areas are going to happen outside of the government sphere, but again, something that I think that the administrations can try to facilitate by updating our trading and investment agreements and by helping to remove some of the barriers to that kind of cooperation. So I think it's going to be a huge area, and South Koreans I think are all in for it. I think that there's not a debate in South Korea about the reality of and the urgency of addressing climate change.
I'll never forget on one of my few trips to Korea, but they tend to be spaced out every decade or so. The last time I went was in 2011, 2012 for a family reunion and wedding. And I could not believe the very micro level at which individuals in their homes recycled, separated, like the gum wrapper from the metallic wrapper on the outside to the plastic cellophane wrapper. It all went into 3 different receptacles. And I remember thinking, gosh, how do we translate that to American culture somehow? Mm-hmm. Maybe as an ambassador, a former ambassador, you can you explain what those cultural differences were that you appreciated and also struggled with? And maybe you can talk about how your current position with the Korea Economic Institute of America benefits from that experience.
Yeah, well, thank you. I again, as I said earlier, Korean culture is a source of continuing kind of fascination to me and study. But the thing that makes me most nervous is when somebody says to me, "Oh, you understand Korea, so please explain it," because I can feel myself, my lack of confidence in what I'm about to say. Korea is a complicated place. I mean, I've always been struck, I guess, by one thing, which is there's this very formal culture, and then there's kind of the more informal culture. And maybe you could say that's true in a lot of places, but I think it's very pronounced in Korea, at least to a foreigner. And the formal culture is the one I was describing a little bit earlier. Again, I would say very influenced still by Confucianism, Neo-Confucianism, very hierarchical. You still see all of that, and the way of speech. It's so embedded in the speech. It's why language is so important. Not just male or female, not just what year you were born, but what month you were born. Where you from, what school you went to, what year you graduated. All of those things. What year you joined the company. And all of this hierarchy. And, I mean, I'm not crazy about all that, but once you learn to operate in it, you kind of have, it has its efficiencies. But I really appreciate the way that that's been, really challenged and evolved over the past 20 years, because I think it has allowed for this much greater explosion of kind of creativity and innovation in Korea that I didn't see in the 70s and 80s when, yes, there was economic growth of 8-9% a year, but it was not only the authoritarian political system, it was kind of this rather repressive work culture and broader culture. I'm older now. I'm kind of nostalgic for some of the formalities of that. I mean, I love things. These seem like little things that the Koreans attach a great deal of importance to insa, to saying hello and goodbye to people, to putting on their best face. It goes a little bit too far. I guess my one thing I'd say about Korea, if I'm going to be a little irreverent, is I kind of like you're saying with the recycling of the trash, is that I do think Koreans are part of that group of people that if it's worth doing, it's worth overdoing. Let's just let's just go all in. So most of the things that I really enjoy about Korea, I also think, wow, I just wish they wouldn't take it quite so far. But I think that we Americans can learn something from that, as I have, I mean, this sense of kind of resilience and drive. And, and I hear this from my friends who do come from families who came here from Korea in the 60s or the 70s or the 80s. And, as they try to understand culture, and I think they really feel that something, and maybe I'm like that in that way, that we got this sense of, okay, I don't like, it doesn't quite sit well with me, some of these cultural practices and so on, but I really appreciate this sense that, yes, we can do better. Yes, it's actually what we Americans sometimes think. I mean, other Americans who are not Korean American think of as very American, as kind of can do, right? Mm-hmm. No obstacle too big. I'm gonna do this, and that I see in Korea. Although, I also see now, I mean, in both Korea and the United States, is a sense of, maybe there are more limits and so on, and the young people are grappling with that. So. Another thing, I guess, that I'm really, whether it's in the area of kind of women's participation in the broader societies or our broader, social and political challenges, I don't want to oversimplify it, but I think there's a lot of shared problems. We have a lot of shared values, but we have a lot of shared problems. The fact that young people in Korea feel now like it's not as easy to get ahead, as it's not, it's not kind of that land of opportunity in South Korea that I think the earlier generations felt. And we see similar trends in the United States. So that, to get to your question about, whether it's the Korea Society, the Korea Economic Institute, in addition to the kind of traditional political and economic and public policy areas where we do have a very important alliance, where our governments work closely together, we have close business ties. I think there's just an enormous dialogue that we can have together about a whole range of things. Not because we're exactly the same, it's because we're not, but because, I think in many ways in South Korea is almost a little bit of the canary in the coal mine, and some of these kind of breaking problems and opportunities of changing technology, of climate change. We see Korea react sometimes because they have to, a little bit sooner or in a little bit different way. And I think we can have a conversation about that. I mean, I'm thinking of things like, when I was in Korea, again, it's now, more than a decade ago as ambassador, social media was changing all the time, but it's the first place I lived, and I've lived a lot of other places too, but where people were starting to use their cell phones to get people out to vote, or to get to people to do a demonstration, and then a million other things in addition to like ordering food or whatever, and then we've seen that happen elsewhere, but we really saw it first in Korea, and I think that sort of continues.
What year would you say you noticed that?
2000, well, smartphones really started coming in 2009. There were some by-elections in 2009, 2010. I also have a memory in 2010 when the South Korean island called Yeonpyeong-do, west of Incheon, was shelled by North Koreans in a very dramatic attack, the first attack by North Korea, an artillery attack on a civilian population in South Korea since the Korean War. And I was actually driving, or more accurately being driven, out to the airport, and the driver, I would say, said to me, turn on the radio. This is when it's good to understand Korean. Say, hey, there's been an attack. I got a phone call. Anyway, we got out to Incheon, and everybody was standing at Incheon Airport looking at the video on their phone. I think that's the first time I realized, wow, this is like happening in real time. I had never, I'm not on the edge of technological change, so I'm not saying people didn't look at videos on their phone before that, but it was like seeing hundreds of people literally standing on the sidewalk outside of Incheon Airport 30 minutes after this attack happened, watching what had happened in the aftermath. Made me think, wow, this is really a different way of information, instant information and reaction.
So at the Korea Economic Institute, I guess, for those of us who don't have a good understanding of what a think tank does, can you explain how you parlay your skills as ambassador to Korea into think tank work? What is it exactly?
Thinking, yeah, it's a stretch. Yeah.
I don't think it's a stretch at all. It sounds actually like very complimentary roles to have.
Yeah.
But
well, yeah, I think tank. I don't know who came up with that word, but unfortunately, it's also been adopted in Korea and it's called think tank or something. But I prefer to call it a public policy institute. But basically, yeah, I mean, and every public policy institute or think tank is a little different. But I think the idea is that part of civil society is, in addition to universities, that you can have kind of groupings where, you try to open your head a little bit more than you can sometimes if you're in a day-to-day job or working in government, where your job is to try to shape and represent and explain a certain policy, but to kind of open the aperture a bit and say, well, does that make sense? And what should we be doing? And also, and very importantly, I think both for the Korea Economic Institute and the Korea Society to think, and this is where I think maybe I add some value because I believe it so deeply, is we Americans need to be a lot smarter about Korea. I mean, about the rest of the world, let's be honest. But the United States looms much larger in Korea than Korea looms in the United States. That's changed a little bit, right, over the decades, and some of it has to do with K-pop and all the rest of it. But still, it's still not. You may have had this experience as well. But when I sometimes say to people, "Oh, I lived in Korea," they say North Korea or South Korea, right? It's so there is a kind of a public, if you like, education and engagement element to it too. So I would say it's trying to open the aperture on a dialogue in Washington with people who are in government, around government, in the national security and business and so on, who have a particular professional need and interest to maybe listen to some other views or read some other papers and think about certain issues and have some issues presented to them that maybe aren't in the day-to-day kind of crisis box, but a little bit longer range. But secondly, the wider public, because I think the other thing about our foreign policy in the United States, and I'd say elsewhere, it's become much more, informed by what does the public support? The new administration is talking about we have to have a foreign policy that works for the middle class. What does that actually mean? I don't think we've quite figured that out, but I think the instinct is important, that people have to understand if we have a trade agreement with Korea or with the rest of Asia, what does that actually do for us? Where does that fit in? But and the thing about the relationship with Korea is like so many who have had the good fortune to see, Korea's extraordinary blossoming, the way that the ties between Korea and the United States are so much deeper, are so much more, complex and rich than they were when I first went there. Those are not the good old days, that was a much more of a very important relationship that had to do with South Korea's survival and with, the dangers it faced. But now it's this very broad and rich relationship from which we both benefit and we can both learn. So I think it's kind of finding people and engaging with people who can speak, write, sort of show that is what makes the work of the Korea Society and the Korea Economic Institute, I think, relevant, and kind of a lot of fun. And just one more example. We're obviously still in a pandemic. It hasn't gone too well here in the United States. Hasn't gone too well for the world. It's obviously a global crisis. And, as I mentioned, I think this is an area where the US and South Korea can and will work closely together going forward. But over the past year, so many Americans who hadn't really thought about Korea say, I heard that Korea's done things a little differently. What have they done? This notion that we have something that we could learn from others is kind of a fairly, unusual concept sometimes for people from a very large country like the United States. But I think there's that interest there, or a whole variety of other things, whether it's the soft power and so on. But Korea held an election in April. It was really the first big democracy to hold a general election. Really in that, spring of that terrible spring of 2020. And they had this huge turnout. It went beautifully. And I think that, we did learn from that. And I do know that there are, local officials throughout this country, and I'm sure throughout the world, who looked at some of that And part of what we want to say is, no, that's not just because they're Asians, or because they're ordered to do something, or I mean, you get these weird, kind of preconceptions that people have to say that has nothing to do with that. But they kind of look and they see this is a country that is, as loud and obstreperous as our own when it comes to political divisions, when it comes to social divisions, when it comes to these challenges. Here's what they're doing. Let's observe that and find if we have some areas where we can both learn, but also where we can cooperate, because I think it's, it's gone the other way too, obviously. So it's a very complementary relationship now, I would say, and a very important one.
Can you give an example of a public policy position or research project that the Korean Economic Institute of America has put forth under your guidance, or maybe if you're not comfortable talking about that, something in the future that you want to work on that really does put in very concrete terms why your average middle-class person in both America and Korea should care about the relationship so much.
Well, one thing that we are hoping to complete in the next few months, think tanks work slowly, is, but we're on pandemic time now too, I guess. But we do hope to complete quite soon, more of an historical look. We actually have a book that we're updating called, it may not sound too exciting, Ambassador's Memoirs, but we actually have side by side the reminiscences of ambassadors, Korean ambassadors to Washington and American ambassadors to Korea, serving from democratization until the current time. So the last, almost 40 years. And so a little bit like I'm talking today, rather personal, what it was like for them, but they also highlight, here are the things I remember that were really important. And you get a picture over time of how that relationship has done all the things I've tried to describe, of this kind of broadening, deepening, ups and downs, and, and very, very relevant to kind of where we are today. So that's one thing. I guess you could call that a little bit more of a retrospective, but we hope to then use that to also foster the kind of discussion we're having. What is diplomacy? What is it that we're doing when we have alliances with other countries? What does that mean? So we want to use it to foster conversations, some with the former ambassadors, some with now people in service now, and students as well who may be thinking about public service, to have that conversation. More generally, I mean, we're called the Korea Economic Institute. We do a lot of different things, but we do try to look at specific areas where the relationship is really changing before our eyes. And one is a lot of South Korean investment in the United States, investment in manufacturing plants, in cutting edge technology, and semiconductor plants. And kind of what that means for the relationship, what that means for, the middle class here. But, coming at it, I hope, in a very rigorous way. We're not trying to say, everything is perfect, but, what are the implications for both countries, for the evolving role of China in the region. So we try to look at it not just from an economic point of view, but from kind of a strategic and geopolitical point of view as well.
Just to clarify, you said South Korean investment in American manufacturing.
Yes, opening plants. Yeah.
Okay. Because it just felt counterintuitive to what my understanding has been of the relationship in the past.
That's right.
Reverse, right?
And that is a fairly recent thing. That's right. That there's been so much direct investment in the United States, and it I won't say it started, but I mean there were big investments now over a decade ago with car manufacturing plants, Hyundai and Kia in the South. There's an LG battery plant that's more recent. Samsung has a big wafer plant, not wafers like those cookies, but the semiconductor in Austin, and is, according to the press, looking for another one. So, I mean, we're obviously in a time right now of such, economic transformation, but I think this is going to be a story that we need to follow more, not just we at our think tank, but more broadly, the business press and our respective governments of how we, again, kind of tweak, if you like, our rules that govern investment and trade. I think one thing that the U.S. and Korea have tried to do is represent what's the right way to do it. We did achieve a free trade agreement in 2000 that was implemented in 2012, so almost 10 years ago. Changed, not renegotiated, but somewhat updated during the Trump administration. But there's so much, there's so much doubt about trade, about the impact of about the benefits and impact of globalization now. South Korea is a trading country. We know that. They can't back off from that. They're right in China's neighborhood with a huge economic relationship with China. So a lot of the sort of, if you like, prime issues of this moment, how are China and the United States going to manage their complicated relationship? Who is going to set the rules of the road, if you like, for trade and international cooperation going forward? There's a security dimension, but there's also a big economics dimension, and increasingly those two are intertwined. I mean, explicitly intertwined. So looking at those issues, I think, is going to be something that's going to occupy not just our little think tank, but I mean everybody in the coming years.
So you also are the chair of the board of directors at the Korea Society, and bringing this conversation now around to the main thrust of it, which is women in leadership roles.
Yeah.
I'd like to pick your brain on what your vision is for the Korea Society, since if I'm not mistaken, you are also the first female chair of the board of directors at the Korea Society. Am I right?
Yeah.
A lot of firsts. So what is your vision? What would you like to accomplish with the Korea Society going forward?
Yeah. Well, I just think this is we always think we live in interesting times, but I do think that this is such a kind of exciting time to be thinking about the U.S.-Korea relationship for all the reasons I've already mentioned. And I think the Korea Society has a kind of a standing and an experience that makes it a natural kind of platform to help share what the important issues in the relationship are. I mean, with respect to, I guess, broadening our base, and you mentioned my being the first woman as chair. I mean, first of all, I have to say my generation is not, I was the first woman in a lot of jobs I had, and that's no particular reflection on my aptitude, or it's more just a kind of a generational thing. I was part of that generation where before us, there just weren't women, in certain areas. But in almost every job I've had, I'm no longer the only woman. And so I'm sure I will not long be the only woman to have served as U.S. Ambassador in Seoul, nor for that matter, the only woman to be chair of the Korea Society. And by the way, I have to say the Korea Society has an amazing number of highly talented women who staff the Korea Society and put together these amazing programs. So, which was always true in Korea and the United States as well over the years. So sometimes it's the leadership positions that are the last to become occupied by women, but the energy has been there and the talent has been there all along. So yeah, I want to help the Korea Society, do more, but do better, and broaden it out a little bit. Broaden it out, the kind of conversations we have. I think frankly the other thing about the U.S.-Korea relationship is because it does have a very important pillar of our military security relationship, of the need to address the unfinished business of North Korea, which certainly includes the threat of nuclear weapons and missiles, but also the division of the peninsula. That national security pillar is extremely important, and we need to have people, if you like, broaden those who are kind of exposed to that and come into that conversation, but also ensure that people do understand. I think that the whole relationship is not defined solely by that. There are these other important pillars in the relationship. So it is a little bit of all of the above, I guess, is what I'm saying to you, because I think that does reflect what the relationship is now.
What do you think women bring to a top leadership position, many of which you've held throughout your career in both diplomacy and now beyond diplomacy? What is it that women bring to a leadership position that men do not? Loaded, I know.
Yeah.
But I can't help but feel like there are marked differences that are worth acknowledging, and they're worth appreciating.
I I mean, that is my experience. That's right. And I have experience, as I'm sure you do, of being in workplaces, meetings, conference rooms, with all men, or I was the only woman. That's why I was there, I guess. And it is different. It's a different experience in being in a room where there is more of a mix. Because I do think men and women bring different things to it, but it's very hard to generalize about because, we're not all the same, men or women, and we all bring different things. But I do know that when you sort of marginalize, an entire half of the population, whether it's on the basis of gender or whatever it's on the basis of, you're just going to narrow your ability to think well, to think broadly, to take into consideration the kind of perspectives that you need to have. And, I guess as a former Foreign Service officer, I try to be very mindful of that because I always felt we Foreign Service officers, we had to remind people in Washington, not just say, hey, there are women out here, hey, there are people out here and they don't live in Washington and they feel a little differently. And I know that may sound sort of condescending to me to say it's that, but people forget. So what do women bring to it? Yeah, I mean, I think it's just a matter of, I think the evidence is very clear that you get better decisions, you get better processes, you get better everything when you have women's participation and participation of those basically who haven't been represented. I mean, I guess you could point to, specific in this pandemic. I mean, what's really struck me among many things is we've seen, certainly in the United States, and I think elsewhere, the participation of women in the workforce, never mind leadership positions, go down. Why has it gone down? Well, I think you could talk about a lot of things, but it's two words, basically, childcare, right?
Right. Yeah, the institutions that were there that working women could rely on faltered during the pandemic, and that support system was not there. So that's interesting. It kind of leads to another question that I had for you. What would you advise to women, young women especially, who are interested in following your career path? I think once you told is it the Oberlin Review? You called your career path a long and winding road. but there are so many women out there who are not going to let a pandemic kill their ambition. What would you advise to somebody who may be daunted by that labor statistic that you just pointed out and are wondering, in a world where I can't take my academic courses in person, when I can't meet with a professor in person, I can't get peer reviewed, I can't spend time with people. How do you propose that women who are interested in a career in the public or private sector, but in like a major leadership capacity, such as you've experienced, is there advice that you could give?
Well, you're right. It's so tough now, and it's so tough for everyone. And I do want to add also Korean women. If you look at the statistics on these highly educated Korean women, this predates the pandemic, who either don't have children or don't have jobs. It is the issue of childcare and education that just keeps them, out of the labor force, notwithstanding all these other government measures, which are many times designed by men. So I had to sort of add that, I suppose, as I think about the Korean experience as well. I don't want to underestimate the kind of challenges that everyone faces now, and I think they do come down particularly hard on women, especially women who have maybe less resources and less means sometimes. But when I say the long and winding road, I think there needs to be a recognition that, or it helps to have a recognition, which I didn't always have as a young person, that not exactly this too will pass, but if you're 20 years old or 25 years old, you got hopefully a big long stretch ahead of you, and certainly women of my generation, there was this kind of sense of this, we have to have it all, let's do it all right now. So how am I going to have a job and 2 kids and, and a job that I have to work 12 hours a day, plus I'm going to, these impossible expectations. So I think it is a time for all of us to kind of lower our expectations of what we can do, at least we can do at one time, and think about what can we do right now. And in this particular time, my advice is going to sound very kind of homespun, I suppose, but I would say things like read books, find a mentor, woman or man, older or younger, someone who you can work with. I mean, find some areas. I mean, I'm trying to do these things myself, and I'm not young, you know. Try to find an internship. We have internships at KEI. They have them at the Korea Society. We've had about a dozen interns now I've never met in person. And we promised that as soon as we can, we're going to have the biggest, most wonderful party, which may not be so much for the Korea economics, but we're going to have a great party and we're going to meet everybody in person. But in the meantime, you know, I have been struck by, but maybe because we do realize now how precious these connections are, and contacts and connections are very, very important in a career and in moving in leadership positions. That's just the reality. So I would say keep working on those. But what do you bring to those? I would say, you know, read, develop an interest in some of these areas that are going to be, you know, needing this attention from us and from us collectively as we come out of, and we're not going to come completely out of it, but as we recover and reshape ourselves out of this crisis. I mean, I do think, and I speak as someone now who's, you know, remembers the end of the Cold War and 9/11 and even some things before that. And I do think this is the most transformative moment that I've been alive in, and it's a little frightening. So I don't know if I can say anything that doesn't sound rather superficial, but I think we have some tools and we've got to learn to use them. And maybe, you know, I've actually read some women sort of say actually that some women feel empowered by Zoom because they don't feel that that the physical aspect of things looms as large. I read that. I thought that was interesting, but I guess that's another thing. I mean, let's think of ways in which we can try to at least to some extent mitigate, but even kind of turn to a little bit of an advantage some of the very unusual, to say the least, the circumstances in which we now find ourselves.
I think in a lot of ways, people would like to know, you've already laid out some of the subjects that you'd like to expand on in your various roles, but can you talk about maybe one or two things that you are extremely proud of having achieved in your very long and still ongoing career? And maybe you can cap off the discussion by talking about what is ahead for you, because I don't think you slowing down is really in the picture.
Oh, well, thank you. That's not, you know, honestly, the things that I'm proud of, I guess, in my career, and that I had a long career of over 30 years working as an American diplomat overseas and in the United States. And part of diplomacy is preventive, right? It's maybe stopping at least the worst thing from happening. And so some of my, I know this is perhaps I can write about it sometime, but some of the things that don't really make it into the news. I mean, writing a report on what was happening to students in Korea and the issue of torture, and highlighting that, and getting my ambassador to send it back, and that having an impact on U.S. policy. Being involved in a negotiation in the Balkans, where I spent quite a bit of time, where, you know, things didn't go great, but there were times when we felt like we helped make them go a little bit better. So those are the kinds of things that I guess in terms of my work, I feel proud of, and they all have to do truly, and this is not any kind of false modesty, with issues where I worked closely with other people. It really is, you know, it's hard to point to one thing where say, hey, I did that, you know, but where I'm proud if I pushed a little harder maybe, or worked a little longer to write it, but then, you know, found other people who were ready to push it forward too. In terms of, I guess, my own career development, you know, I guess I'd kind of say, so when I was asked to go to Korea as ambassador in 2008, I hadn't lived in Korea for, you know, like almost 20 years, and I'd only been back like once. I said I'd been in Europe, and but you know, I really thought, I want to get off that plane, and I want to make a press statement in Korean. I want to, because I knew the kind of impact. I thought I knew, but then I was terrified. I was just terrified, you know, because it was just like scratching off all the rust on my aging brain, you know. And I also know Koreans can be, shall we say, very judgmental, especially of American ambassadors, especially of women sometimes. So I was super, super nervous about this, even as, you know, I was an ambassador. This is what I got off, and I did it. And I can't say I did it very well, but I did it. And I'll tell you, those first 3 days I was in Seoul, I was walking around, just settling in. So nice people. And I have to say, now that I think about it, especially young women, they were running up to me on the street.
Oh, wow.
Saying to me in Korean, we're so happy you're here. And you understand us, and and the Korean hyperbole, then, hey, you're so wonderful, but they felt they could speak to me in Korean. It wasn't about, I said something that made them change their minds about the US role or US policy on North Korea. As they heard me speak Korean, they said, hey, I can actually go and talk to her. And the other thing, now you're really going, the other thing I had from actually a lot of the politicians I met, mostly men, the National Assemblymen, after I've been for it, because then I kept it up. I didn't do everything in Korean, but I do a lot of public speeches in Korean. I go on Korean TV and, whatnot, and kind of, fortunately in Korea, you can always read from a text. It's okay, And I'd have these National Assemblymen, and they'd say to me, oh, my wife and I, we saw you on the morning show this morning. And my wife said to me, don't give her a hard time. Because an American ambassador can be a little bit of a punching bag in politics anywhere, right? So I don't know if I'm proud of that, but that was a good, I'm happy that I had, I was willing to risk, I guess, taking a little risk to do that. So but for the future, I think you've heard what I think that where I can add value. I want to add a little value here is I hope by encouraging others, by being inspired by others, especially the younger generation coming up. And, we all need to be inspired right now, because I really do think that this is such a moment of great challenge, but it also means it's a moment of great hope too. And so I know it may sound just a little superficial, but I just really want to try to contribute. And I think if I have a little bit of a niche in the history of U.S.-Korean relations and in thinking about women in diplomacy, women in that relationship, and that's something we want to highlight in this. There are 4 Korean-American Congress members now, and 3 are women. 0 to 3 in one election. That's another sign that when Koreans do it, they go all out. 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. Those kinds of things give me a lot of hope and excitement. And so I'm really looking forward to learning from, those voices and those other, experiences from mine and more recent experiences, because I really do think that there's a lot we can do together.
Well, I love that story about you holding a press conference in Korean. I can barely speak honorific to the older members of my family. That is truly impressive. And really,
I speak honorific to the dog, so.
I think that's definitely something to shoot for in hopefully just the months to come, that you are able to reconnect in that way. That seems to be so meaningful to you. And Ambassador Kathleen Stephens, thank you so much for sharing what this niche that you've developed has meant. And I hope that our audience has a greater appreciation for how that niche can give you quite the edge when you just follow the passion that led you in the first place. So congratulations on a really a successful career so far. And we really look forward to hearing more about it. Perhaps before we wrap it up for this segment, could you maybe talk about how people can get involved from an academic or legislative point of view with the work that you are doing, in case they are interested in becoming more involved?
Yes, well, the Korea Economic Institute is based in Washington, D.C. We do have offices on 18th and K Street. Right now, we're much more active online, to say the least, and you can find us on our website at keia.org. We do talks on a whole variety of topics, academic talks. We visit universities. If there's anyone who's taking a class, perhaps on something related to Korea or U.S. foreign policy, we're happy to help with speakers, suggestions, and so on. And of course, right in New York is the Korea Society, again, working mostly virtually, but with an extraordinary range of programs, which you can find by looking at the Korea Society website, and everything from old movies to new movies to arts and culture to the really pressing issues in the U.S.-South Korea alliance as we have a new administration here in Washington and as Korea enters an election year. So there's going to be a lot happening this year and next.
Okay. Well, Ambassador Stephens, thanks again. Thank you to the Korea Society too, and to our audience members who are interested in more about the Korea Society. It has a YouTube channel that you'll want to check out. And that's also where you can continue to see more on this Women in Leadership series. And thank you, Ambassador Stephens, for helping us to kick this off. It was truly a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you so much, Vivian. All the best to you.
Thank you.